This kit is one of the lucky ones that wasn't destroyed by fire. It's the last model produced by Rosso Corporation before it went bankrupt after its factory in Japan burned down. Much of the stock of this Ferrari was destroyed, but not this one. It sat around in Australia for over 30 years before finally being assembled to what you see here. Let's have a look at the build of this legendary and large 1/8 scale version of the 1991 Ferrari 643 by Rosso Corporation. The owner made a start many years ago, assembling and decorating the nose, fitting the tyres and getting some of the brackets and bulkheads into the monocoque, but he didn't have time to finish it, so handed it over to me and gave permission to publish the build. The kit is engineered to be a mostly screw-together model that, once assembled, is getting on to 2.5 kilograms in weight. It's big and it's heavy. There are a few pieces that need glue, but it's basically a snip it off and screw it on kit, and for the most part, pretty straightforward. There are no painting callouts in the instructions, which is a 32-page book. The body parts are metal and pre-painted in a brilliant red, and there are plenty of plated parts, clear pieces, stickers, lots of different shape and size screws, and even suede for the Ferrari emblems on the seat and the headrest. Despite all of these pieces, the kit lacks some important detail. There are no tubes, wires or hoses supplied other than the radiator pipes, and many parts, such as the brakes, are like this. But in real life, they're made of various materials of different colour. So we decided to lift the realism with some detail painting and extra parts, some purchased and some from the scrap bin. And I'll explain in more detail what we did later in the video. The fit is overall pretty good. It was tight in a few areas and a bit of a challenge to get the main floor screws aligned, but generally there were no significant issues. What you do have to be careful with is screw selection. They're all in labelled bags, but with the way they're numbered, it's easy to grab the wrong one. Holes to accept the screws are manufactured into the parts, but there were a couple where, for whatever reason, there's no hole, such as here on the valve cover. We also had to source some new decals. The kit's self-adhesive stickers were mostly okay, but the water slide decals fell apart when trying to apply them. We were able to source an aftermarket set from Belgium that also included the tobacco markings, but they cost a fortune. Anyway, onto the build. Like many of the parts, the steering wheel is just black plastic and the instructions just tell you how to mount it, and that's all. So I hit it with some semi-gloss black on the centerpiece and some black surface primer to get a bit of a contrasting textured look for the outer rim. And then the bolt heads and buttons were painted with a small brush. The prancing horse is a sticker which has a clear lens over the top. The kit includes a sheet of silver self-adhesive heat shielding, but you have to cut it up to fit onto various parts. So this is for the rear bulkhead, and there's some cutouts there to slip over the engine mountings that are protruding from the back of the monocoque. Lots of plated parts. These are the brake discs, and they're in two halves, a front half and a back half. So I just checked the fitting of everything by screwing it together first, and it all fits okay. So the pads and pistons are masked off, and then I hit them with a bit of Tamiya titanium colour and brush painted the pads matte black. The brake hats were also sprayed with the titanium colour, and that had to be masked off so the rotor surfaces could be sprayed a different colour. So I used a liquid mask on the front half and just some masking tape cut circular and put on the back half. These were then hit with some Tamiya light gunmetal, and once the masking came off, everything was looking good. When the discs are assembled, the front half and back half hold a nut captive in the middle, and that allows the disc to be screwed up onto the hubs and still allow them to rotate. I then finished them off with some wash, and overall I think the brake assemblies have come up really well. Interestingly, the kit did not include Brembo markings for the calipers, and I can only assume that that's some sort of licensing issue. So it recommended to put temperature stickers on, which is what we did, but when the aftermarket decals turned up, they had Brembo markings, so it did get the proper Brembo branding at the end of the build. All of the suspension arms are die-cast metal and pre-painted in a semi-gloss black, but this pushrod in particular had a lot of paint missing, flaking off the underside of it, and also quite a heavy casting line down the middle. So I decided to remove the casting line, filing and sanding that smooth, and repainting the pushrods. I also masked off the ends and hit that with an SMS stainless steel colour. The front shock absorbers and linkages are cast and plated as one piece, which looks a bit boring. So same sort of deal. I decided to take the moulding lines off and then go ahead and repaint these in a number of colours. So after priming, these were hit with a gloss black and then some super silver on the lower half and titanium gold on some of the fittings. And they were finished off with a grey sticker that was included in the kit and also some wash just to bring out the detail. The ignition box was painted semi-gloss black and then the straps masked off and hit with a Tamiya rubber black. And I then added various wires to the ignition box. The colour is corrected later on in the build. This is more to just check that things will fit. This is just the front suspension hardware laid out just so you can get an idea of the various pieces that make up the front end. And as I said, most of this, well, all of this was pre-painted, but I repainted the push rods. And this just shows a couple of the screws in the front end. For the lower A-arm, it uses a different screw for the front pickup compared to the rear pickup. So there's button head screws, there's flat tops and ones with tapers and countersunks. And you just got to make sure you've got the right screw. But all of the suspension arms and the steering rods, fairly straightforward screwing them in. Now this model, the suspension does not operate. The steering does, but the suspension is fixed in place. And the shocks just mount to the top of the monocoque, followed by the push rods and bell crank. This is one area where there was a bit of a tight fit, so I had to drill the hole in the top of the push rod mounts a little bit bigger so that the pin and the bell cranks could fit into it properly. And that sort of finished off the front suspension. So I took the opportunity to put this into the photo booth because once the engine was on, this model was going to be too big for in the photo booth. The roll hoop is one of the things that had to be glued on, and that's a two-piece thing. There's two halves to the roll hoop. And also see the heat shielding, how it wraps around the sides of the fuel tank. It was then on to the V12 engine and semi-automatic gearbox. All these parts are cast in black plastic and not intended to be painted according to the kit instructions. I wanted to make this look a bit more realistic, so all of the parts were prepared for paint and then hit with a mixture of semi-gloss black with a bit of light gunmetal added into it, just so it looks like a sort of a metallic black colour. These are some of the internal support structures for the rear bodywork, and they had heavy seam lines in them, so I scraped those off and then hit them with SMS aluminium colour. And again, this is just a bit of a layout of some of the parts that make up the rear suspension with the upper and lower arms and push rods, etc. And I masked and sprayed the gold fittings. And this is all straightforward assembly, just screwing the various parts in the right order, and then closed off with the bell housing transaxle casing. And that just clicks into place and secured by a single screw, and there's lots of other holes in this for further parts to be added later in the build. This is an example of where there's been a bit of a failure in the manufacturing. There's supposed to be a hole in the top of this valve cover, and the metal bracket at the top has got pins on it that locate and screw into various holes on the valve cover. But this one had not been drilled out. It was so that had to be done manually. The cam covers were also sprayed that sort of metallic black I was talking about before, but then I masked off the central strip and hit that with a semi-gloss black, just so there's a bit of a contrast. And I assume the spark plugs and leads are all underneath that cover because there's no exposed spark leads on the real car. This is just another example of parts that have come off the sprue that, in my opinion, can be further enhanced with a little bit of painting and wash. The alternator and these pulleys and belts just get fitted to the front of the engine, which unfortunately most of this is basically invisible to see once it's assembled, but we know it's there. And just starting to fit some further pieces on the gearbox. There's the oil tank here, and again I've got that white tubing. The colour is corrected before the build is finished, but it's more just to get it in place so I know where to route things because, as I said, cables, wires, etc. just were not included with the kit. Same deal with this part. I'm not sure what the part is. I assume it's got something to do with the semi-automatic gearbox. But anyway, it's supposed to have lots of wires coming out of it, so I just used tie wire for that, drilled some holes into the plastic part, glued them in place, and threaded them through across the top of the gearbox. This is the inner bodywork through the what they call the Coke bottle section at the rear of the car. But you'll see here there's a bit of flash from the casting, and that's been painted over, so had to be careful breaking and filing that off to get a nice clean finish. And while the kit included heat shielding for the floor and the back of the monocoque, it didn't include any shielding for these side pieces. So I just used some foil from the seal of a butter container and glued that on the inner surfaces and just hand painted some black across the top here so that none of the red was visible from the inside of the model. These were then fitted in place just to check the fit and making sure everything is going to be okay for getting screwed together afterwards. In fact, I screwed these in place because if it was a glue model, this would be a bit more of an issue. But because we can screw things in and then take them out again, I fitted these in place just to make sure it was all fitting so when the main body sits on, everything lines up okay. So with those inner body panels fitted in place, and they are partially glued in place at this point, but after they're in place, the drive shafts and the rear hubs and brake assemblies can be screwed on. And just more parts fitted. The jack mounting points just screw on, that they're metal fittings, and the rain light added on. The kit includes double-sided adhesive to stick the rain light in its place, but the adhesive has gone off over the age of the kit, so just use some crystal clear to fit that red lens. There's also the oil cooler with temperature stickers on. With the rear suspension, those are proper metal springs that are on the shock absorbers. Shock absorber is multi-piece that has to be assembled, but as I said before, doesn't actually operate. I was then moving on to the fuel and intake system, which is just a small number of parts, and some of them are plated. But again, there's improvements can be made because the main fuel rails here had very heavy seam lines running down the outside edges. Decided to fix that, so I scraped the mold lines off and stripped the plating, and then went through the process of priming, hitting it with gloss black, and then spraying alclad polished aluminium over the top. The fittings were just brush painted with a bit of clear blue. And on the main intake tray, I put some bare metal foil around that, just to, again, just give it a little bit more contrast compared to the plating from the kit. And all 24 injectors were hand painted with the red. And so this is the underside of the assembly. And then it gets screwed onto the model, just with a couple of screws down through two of the intake trumpets, which is not ideal, but once the air intake goes on, you're not going to see that anyway. The main floor is one huge piece, and thankfully not twisted. It often happens with injection moulding with large pieces, they get a bit of a twist or a bend in it, but this was dead flat. There were a few pieces that had to be added, some glued in place at the back of the floor and others screwed to the floor up the front. The heat shielding again is just the sticker that comes with the kit. On reflection, I probably should have filled the ejection pinholes because once the sticker is burnished down, they become visible. Also needed to cut out where the mounting holes are, and the larger one there is for if you want the model to be attached to a base, there's a captive nut that can go into the engine cover, so there needs to be a hole for the bolt to go through to get to the nut. The firebomb is the original kit plating, and I've just put a couple of chrome strips on the mounting strap just to provide some contrast, and then the decal on it, and that's come up really good. It's also got fittings, so if you wanted to go down the road of plumbing the firebomb through the cockpit, you could, but when the seat gets fitted, half of that firebomb and the fittings, you can't see them anyway. The radiators get screwed to the base, and I just used some wash on the lower cooler here just to provide some contrast. And this is another part of the model that's basically invisible once it's all assembled, which is the pedals. I just painted them with some metallic colours and dry brushed some silver to give the appearance of some wear. And again, this is just another test fit of the engine to the floor, but with the exhaust pipes fitted. You'll see shortly that the exhausts have got some really heavy seam lines, and I've decided to strip all of the plating off and redo them. But again, this is just making sure it all fits. The seat is pre-painted and pre-flocked to simulate sort of a suede finish. All that was needed was some flash to be trimmed from the hole where the seatbelts go through. The seatbelts are some sort of woven material with a sticky backing, and so that needs to be threaded through the buckles. I initially wondered why Rosso had not used metal-plated buckles, but then when I look back at the period photos, as opposed to how the car is now, the black colour is correct. And also up the top is one of the little suede emblems that have to be cut out and stuck on the model. This is the only plumbing that's included in the kit, which is the coolant hoses to and from the radiator, and all of these pipes, as well as all of the exhaust pieces on this model, have got really heavy seam lines. It's a lot of work, but I decided to clean up all of those mold lines. All of the coolant pipes got hit with alclad polished aluminium, as well as this little tank thing. Something that I think really enhanced the overall look of the model was adding brake lines. Now again, the kit does not include any of that, so I've just used some scrap electrical wire here for the lines itself to run from the caliper up onto the car, and was able to source some little miniature zip ties, or cable ties some people call them, and they're available in various scales in the packet. These are really fiddly to work with, but they operate a bit like a real zip tie, in that you have to wrap the thing around the parts and thread it through a tiny little hole and pull it up. Now you need to be really careful because they're really fragile. I destroyed a number of them, but you can see here the tails, I've pulled them up and the tails are ready to clip off. Just use a little bit of super glue so that they don't unravel. Another piece that had a little modification was this. I don't actually know what the piece is. I suspect it's something to do with the fuel line, but I wanted to plumb a line in and lines out. So I needed to drill out some holes and put some little pins in there so that we could attach some cables. And that just gets fitted to one side of the engine. And this little tank or reservoir, I've added some heat shielding on that because that's what I saw in photographs of the real car. Also, this is the start of the radiator plumbing being put on the model as well, and some of the connectors and fittings are just stickers that are supplied in the kit. There is a temperature sensor in the upper pipe, so I drilled that out so that we could add a wire to it later on in the build. So finally, we get two main parts that need to be joined together. And that was fairly straightforward, just lining everything up and screwing it together. There is a metal bulkhead in the back of the monocoque internally that the engine mounts to. And once all 4 screws are done up, it's actually a fairly stiff and rigid structure. And once the engine's on to the back of the chassis, the rest of the coolant pipes can then be added. Now these pipes that run down the side of the engine, to keep those close together, I've put some tie wire on there, so it looks like it's been cable tied, and all of the loose wires there, that gets tidied up later on. The seat and belts module just drops in and gets screwed from a single screw underneath to hold that in place. And then on to the exhausts. Now, like the coolant pipes, really heavy seam lines, and to such an extent that the pipes, a couple of them are really what I would consider to be out of shape. So a lot of work went into cleaning those up. I also decided to drill out the tailpipes a little bit more. The model does have a recess, as you can see here on the right-hand side compared to after I've drilled it on the left, but I just thought making those holes deeper would give a better illusion of a hollow pipe. Also had to fill in some ejection pin holes that are just part of the manufacturing process. And this is just stripping the plating off the exhaust pieces. Only takes a few minutes and then you can get on with the build. All of the extractors were inserted into the engine and also to the collector, and tape is just used here to brace all of this. And then I used glue in the collector area to make this basically one piece, so it could be fitted as one piece afterwards. So all these exhaust pieces are glued together, but they're not actually glued to the model yet. And that's because they need to come out and the errors fixed, such as the ejection pin holes and some of the gaps and moulding irregularities in some of the pipes. So some of those I filled with Tamiya putty, others I used some of homemade sprue goo. And while I had the Tamiya surface primer out, I also filled in some gaps and sinkholes in the airbox. And they were sanded down smooth so that the airbox and also the pipes can be primed. Rear wing, very straightforward assembly. It's 8 pieces all up with 12 tiny screws. That was almost like just a little 5-minute job to get it all together. Just going with the plastic finish here, had considered painting it and trying to remove a few of the ejection pin holes, but then you might notice here that it's got a carbon texture moulded into the parts, and I was happy just to go with that. The exhaust pipe assemblies got hit with some SMS stainless steel for the metallic finish. But before gluing it to the engine, I used some thinners on a cotton swab to take off the paint and primer from around the mounting pins. And thankfully, after all of that work, the pipes lined up and fitted into the model quite okay. And while we're looking at this, you can also see the little temperature sensor wire that I made up, and again, just trying to replicate what I saw in photos. Not 100% accurate, but it doesn't look too bad. Same sort of deal with the lambda sensors in the collectors. I've just used a bit of copper wire here that gets dulled down a little bit later on, just so that there's some cabling running to those. And further wiring between the cockpit and the engine doesn't really lead anywhere, but again, the car did have cables and wires running between the two, and also a tube running from the radiator across the top and around to the engine area. Photos of the real car also revealed additional heat shielding just under the exhaust area. So again, cut up more of that foil that we used in some other places and stuck that down on the floor. Attaching the floor was a bit of a nervous moment because there's quite a few screws, about a dozen of them all up, fit the floor into various parts of the chassis. Now, you also need to remember before you put the floor on, if you're going to be mounting this onto a base, you need to put the captive screws in first underneath the model, and then the floor holds those in place. So, as I said, about a dozen screws, and after a bit of manipulation, they all ended up finding the correct places and screwed up tight. The inside of the body was basically just overspray and aluminium colour, so I've just brush painted this. This is just the first coat. I've got a couple of coats of semi-gloss black underneath, and this is just a bit of a progress mock-up. The nose cone and rear wing are just sitting in place, and the body and wheels there as well. So it's looking, coming together quite well. The aftermarket decals settled down really well over the carbon fibre texture, so that was good. But what wasn't good is the white ink on the number decals is a little bit too thin in places, so there's a bit of bleed through you can see, particularly down on the 7 there. So you don't really notice it from a distance, but when you, like a lot of things, when you get up close, you think, oh, okay, yeah, that's not right. One problem with the aftermarket ones, though, was for the AGIP sign, they didn't realise that it's not tapered on both sides. Left side decal is different to the right. Mirrors and stalks are just one piece metal with a thread cut on the end. A nut just secures those in place. The mirror material is supplied in the kit, and it's just a piece of mirror sticker, basically, pre-cut. So just peel that off, drop it in place, perfect. This is the felt sticker that simulates the suede embroidered Ferrari emblems that go onto the seat and also the headrest. And you need to be very careful cutting these out because the material easily damaged and frays around the edges when you cut it. This is the aftermarket decal for the driver, which includes the correct fluorescent red colour for the chevron. The photo doesn't do the brightness of this justice. The decal set also included the Marlboro signage, which you can elect to put on for certain Grand Prix or leave it off. All of the other main sponsor logos here are all from the aftermarket waterslide decals, and they went on really well, just with a bit of the microset system. The airflow blankings are metal and pre-painted. Again, the kit calls for some double-sided adhesive stickers to secure them, but I've put them in with crystal clear because I was concerned about the adhesive and its age. I had considered grinding out the vents in the engine cover to be a bit more realistic, and that would involve having to then also strip and repaint the body. But I was concerned I was not going to get paint of the resilience of what's on the model, which I assume is some sort of baked enamel. So added the decals, and I haven't put clear coat over it because just worried about reactions with the only set of decals that we could find, didn't want to damage them. When the owner first started building the kit, put the fluorescent yellow decals on the top of the wing flaps, but that was many years ago and they've faded out to be basically almost white. So those were removed and replaced with the aftermarket ones. The upper part of the cockpit in black is a separate plastic piece that gets fitted to the model. It includes this little nub here, and that's for securing a small clear windshield that comes with the kit. Now, I couldn't find it anywhere, so decided to make up my own. I just used a piece of clear transparency, drilled a hole to mount it off that tab, and then carefully cut down to shape to get a windshield that looks like what I see in photos. Now, this windshield is a different shape from race to race and driver to driver, so we were just looking for something that was a shallow lip that ran around the outside edge. Ended up getting something that looked pretty good. The funny thing is, on the day I delivered the finished model to the owner, I found the strip. This is just showing that I did add a wire to the rain light. You can also see some plumbing and stickers on the oil cooler and that control box thingy that sits on top of the gearbox. Rear wing just fits on the mount, screws in place quite easily. The nose cone just uses 4 cap screws to connect it to the fittings that are on the monocoque. That did take a little bit of work to get all 4 of them to line up at once, but it fits on and it's all nice and square and flat. So again, a thumbs up for Rosso for getting the engineering of this kit really good. Just as I was getting towards just finishing off the last little bits of the build, I somehow almost super glued my finger to the fuel tank. Got my finger off quick enough, but it left this patch. So I had to go through the process of taping around it, sanding down as much as I could to get the glue off, and then masking up and spraying some semi-gloss or more of a flat black on it to try and match the rest of the car. Very frustrating when I saw that. I'm sure the neighbours heard me, but the repair has come up okay. It's not perfect. If you get the right light on it, you can see there's an issue, but yeah, just the way it is. Really frustrating. Anyway, airbox goes on, screws onto the intake tray on top of the engine. When it comes to the tyres, I masked off the tread and the rim, then hit the sidewalls with some gloss clear. And the reason for that is to give the decals, water slide decals, something better to hold on to, because they don't always like going down onto rubber. And then they were given a very light misting of some Tamiya smoke, clear smoke, over the top, just to take that bright whiteness off them. And then I mixed up some clear mixture of gloss with probably about 20, maybe 30% flat to give a sort of a satin type finish to the sidewall, and ended up coming up pretty good, I thought. Another addition that the kit doesn't include were some supporting straps from the chassis to the floor, and these were just made from some evergreen styrene and then just hit with some metal colour and super glued in place. If you're looking for one of these models to build, there are still kits around. Just go and have a look on eBay, for example. But they come with a hefty price tag because there is no possibility of a re-release, and it's unlikely to be tooled in this scale by another manufacturer. Also keep in mind the decals are likely to be shot just because of the age of the kit. The model has a presence. In the display cabinet, it stands out and looks brilliant. Absolutely, there is plenty of scope for further detail, but even with just the additions we've made on it, I think it looks really good. Rosso manufactured the 643 across several scales. I built the 143 scale version several years ago now, and like the big one, it has lift-off bodywork, detail underneath, metal suspension and rubber tyres. So here's the build video for the little Ferrari. Cheers.